There are moments in life that divide everything into two parts. The life you thought you had, and the life that was actually happening while your back was turned. For Sarah Mitchell, that moment came on a rainy Thursday evening when she stood outside room 814 of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. Her hands were shaking, not because she was afraid of what she might find, because deep down, she already knew. The text message had arrived by mistake just 37 minutes earlier. A photograph, a hotel room number, and one sentence that changed everything. They're together right now. Sarah stared at the door for what felt like an eternity. 20 years of marriage stood on one side. The truth stood on the other. And when she finally pushed the door open, she found her husband Daniel exactly where she feared he would be. But what happened next wasn't the screaming match you might expect. It wasn't tears. It wasn't rage. In fact, the reason this story became so shocking had nothing to do with what Sarah saw inside that room. It had everything to do with what she decided not to do afterward. Because while Daniel believed his secret had finally been exposed, another secret had been hiding in plain sight for years. A secret involving money, trust, carefully crafted lies, and a plan so calculated that even Sarah would struggle to believe it when she uncovered the truth. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, if you think this is simply a story about a cheating husband and a betrayed wife, stay with us. Because what Sarah discovered in the months that followed would reveal that the affair was only the beginning. The real betrayal was something far bigger. And by the time Daniel realized Sarah knew the truth, it was already too late. 3 months before the hotel room, Sarah Mitchell believed she understood her life. Not perfectly. Nobody does. But well enough. At 42 years old, she had built something that looked stable from the outside. A comfortable home in one of Chicago's quieter suburbs. A successful consulting career that allowed her flexibility. Friends she trusted. A marriage that had survived nearly 20 years. And Daniel. For most people who knew them, Daniel and Sarah were the couple everyone assumed would last forever. They had met in college. Back when neither of them had money. Back when they shared cheap apartments, second-hand furniture, and dreams that felt much larger than their bank accounts. Sarah remembered those years often. The nights spent eating takeout on the floor because they couldn't afford a dining table. The road trips in unreliable cars. The endless conversations about what their future might become. Daniel had always been ambitious. That was one of the things she admired most about him. While other people complained about their circumstances, Daniel constantly looked ahead. He wanted more. A bigger career. A bigger life. A bigger future. And for a long time, Sarah believed they were building that future together. What she didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, Daniel had started building a second future as well. One she knew nothing about. If you had visited their home during those years, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. That's how these stories often begin. Not with obvious warning signs. Not with dramatic arguments. But with small changes so gradual, they almost seem insignificant. A late meeting here. An unexpected business trip there. A phone call taken in another room. A new password. An unexplained expense. Each detail too small to trigger alarm. Each detail easy to explain away. And Sarah explained away all of them. Because trust has a strange effect on people. When you trust someone completely, your mind automatically searches for innocent explanations, not suspicious ones. Looking back later, Sarah would realize the signs had been there for years. But at the time, she saw only what she wanted to see. A husband working hard. A husband under pressure. A husband trying to provide. The same thing happened with Lauren Parker. The woman who would eventually become the center of Sarah's nightmare. Lauren entered Sarah's life almost 8 years earlier. The friendship happened naturally. At least that's what Sarah believed. Lauren was warm, funny, confident. The kind of person who could make an entire room feel comfortable within minutes. She remembered their first meeting clearly. A charity fundraiser hosted by mutual friends. Lauren had arrived late, spilled a drink on herself almost immediately, and somehow managed to turn the embarrassment into the funniest story of the evening. Everyone loved her, including Sarah, especially Sarah, because beneath Lauren's confidence was something that felt genuine, or at least appeared genuine. Over time, they became inseparable. Weekend brunches, shopping trips, holiday gatherings, girls' weekends, phone calls that lasted hours. Lauren wasn't simply a friend. She became family. The kind of friend who had a key to your house. The kind of friend who knew your fears, your insecurities, your dreams. The kind of friend you trust completely. And that's what made what happened later so devastating. Not because Lauren betrayed Sarah, but because she did it while standing close enough to hear Sarah's heartbeat. For years, Daniel and Lauren appeared to get along exactly the way a husband and best friend should. Friendly, comfortable, normal. Nothing about their interaction stood out. Nothing raised suspicion. Nothing seemed inappropriate. If anything, Sarah felt grateful they got along so well. Many friendships become complicated when spouses don't connect. That never seemed to be a problem. At family gatherings, Daniel and Lauren joked easily. At cookouts, they helped prepare food together. At parties, they shared conversations. It looked harmless, natural, exactly the kind of relationship healthy adults should have. And perhaps that's why Sarah never questioned it. Because nobody suspects danger from something that appears normal. Years passed. Life moved forward. Careers improved. Financial stability increased. The future looked bright, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, subtle changes were already taking place. The first shift came after Daniel launched his consulting firm. The company grew quickly, faster than anyone expected. Suddenly, Daniel wasn't just an employee. He was an owner, a founder, a businessman with employees depending on him. The pressure increased dramatically. So did the travel. At first, Sarah understood. Building something successful required sacrifice. Late nights became common. Weekend meetings became common. Unexpected travel became common. Daniel always had explanations, and most of them sounded reasonable. The problem wasn't that his explanations failed to make sense. The problem was that Sarah stopped asking questions altogether. Because when trust becomes habit, curiosity often disappears. Then something else happened. Lauren became more involved in Daniel's professional world. Not directly, not officially. At least that's how it appeared. She started mentioning business topics more often, asking questions about projects, discussing investment opportunities, offering opinions about growth strategies. It seemed harmless. After all, friends discuss work all the time. Yet looking back, Sarah would later remember how interested Lauren always seemed whenever finances entered the conversation. Interested wasn't even the right word. Focused, as though she were quietly collecting information, one detail at a time, without anyone noticing. Still, Sarah remained unaware. Because life was busy. Because trust felt easier than suspicion. Because nobody wakes up one morning expecting the two people closest to them to be working together behind their back. Then came the first moment that truly mattered. Though Sarah wouldn't realize its importance until much later. It happened at a dinner party nearly a year before the hotel room. The evening had been ordinary. Friends gathered around a long dining table. Wine glasses. Laughter. Stories. The usual comfort of familiar company. At one point, Sarah left the room to answer a phone call. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When she returned, she noticed something strange. Not alarming, just strange. The room had gone unusually quiet. Daniel and Lauren stopped talking almost immediately. And for a split second, both looked uncomfortable. The moment passed quickly. Too quickly. Daniel changed the subject. Lauren laughed. Everyone continued eating. But Sarah remembered the feeling. A feeling she couldn't explain. A feeling that disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Months later, she would replay that memory again and again. Because sometimes your instincts recognize danger long before your mind does. And sometimes the most important warning signs aren't the ones you can prove. They're the ones you can't stop thinking about afterward. At the time, however, Sarah dismissed it. Just another harmless moment. Just another misunderstanding. Just another coincidence. She had no idea that while she was building a life based on trust, two people she loved were already building something else entirely. And very soon, the first crack in their carefully constructed story would finally begin to appear. The first crack appeared so quietly that Sarah almost missed it. If someone had asked her later to identify the exact moment she began doubting Daniel, she probably wouldn't have been able to do it. There was no dramatic revelation. No lipstick on a collar. No mysterious phone call in the middle of the night. Just a growing collection of moments that didn't fit together the way they used to. At first, it was Daniel's phone. For nearly 2 decades, neither of them had cared much about privacy. Not because they checked each other's devices, but because there was never a reason to hide them. Phones sat on kitchen counters. Laptops remained open on coffee tables. Passwords were shared without discussion. Then one day, Without explanation, Daniel changed all of that. His phone suddenly never left his side. When he showered, it went into the bathroom. When he slept, it stayed face down on the nightstand. When messages arrived, he tilted the screen away without realizing he was doing it. The changes were subtle enough that Sarah couldn't point to any single behavior and call it suspicious. Yet together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are difficult to ignore once you notice them. The second crack appeared several weeks later. It was a Saturday morning. Sarah was cleaning the kitchen while Daniel worked in his home office upstairs. Lauren stopped by unexpectedly with coffee and pastries. At least that's what she claimed. The visit itself wasn't unusual. Lauren had been dropping by unannounced for years. What felt unusual was what happened afterward. Lauren barely stayed 20 minutes. Most of the time, her visits lasted hours. But this time she seemed distracted, restless, checking her phone repeatedly. Then she left almost as quickly as she arrived. 30 minutes later, Daniel announced he needed to leave for an emergency client meeting. A Saturday meeting. Something Sarah had never heard him mention before. Again, she didn't think much of it. Not then. But that evening she happened to notice Lauren's social media account. The photo posted earlier that day showed Lauren sitting at an outdoor cafe. The timestamp, the location, the outfit. Something about it bothered Sarah. Because the cafe was nearly 40 miles away. And the photo had been taken at almost the exact time Lauren supposedly stopped by the house. At first Sarah assumed she was mistaken. Then she zoomed in and noticed something in the background. A reflection in the cafe window. A man sitting across from Lauren. His face wasn't visible, but the watch on his wrist was. A silver watch with a distinctive blue face. Daniel owned that exact watch. One of only a few thousand produced worldwide. Sarah stared at the image longer than she cared to admit. Eventually, she closed the app, told herself she was imagining things, and moved on. At least, she tried to. Because once doubt enters a relationship, it rarely stays confined to a single moment. It begins spreading, connecting dots, revisiting memories, questioning assumptions, looking for explanations. And before long, Sarah found herself noticing things she had overlooked for years. The business trips, the overlapping schedules, the unexplained absences, the private conversations that ended when she entered a room. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, however, they painted a picture she didn't want to see. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late October, cold enough for jackets, dark before dinner. Daniel told Sarah he needed to attend a networking event downtown. Nothing unusual. Events like that happen regularly. He left around 6. Sarah spent the evening reading in the living room. At approximately 9:30, her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. No greeting. No explanation. Just a photograph. Sarah frowned. The image showed Daniel's car parked outside a luxury hotel. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Then another message arrived. He's not at a networking event. Sarah's stomach tightened. Immediately, she typed a reply. Who is this? No response. Instead, another photograph appeared. This time the image was closer. Clearer. Daniel entering the hotel lobby. Alone. At least from what the picture showed. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Not because she knew what was happening, but because she suddenly realized she couldn't be certain anymore. For almost 20 years, certainty had been the foundation of her marriage. Now that certainty was beginning to crack. Again she typed a response. Who are you? Why are you sending me this? Several minutes passed. Nothing. Then one final message appeared. Room 814. If I were you, I'd get there before midnight. And just like that, the conversation ended. No name. No explanation. No further contact. Sarah sat frozen on the couch, reading the messages over and over. Part of her wanted to delete them. Pretend none of it existed. Wait for Daniel to come home and explain everything. But another part of her couldn't ignore the feeling building inside her. A feeling that had been growing for months. Perhaps years. The feeling that pieces of her life no longer fit together. And maybe never had. At 10:15, Sarah grabbed her keys. At 10:40, she parked across the street from the hotel. At 10:52, she walked through the lobby. At 10:58, she stood outside room 814. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Not because she knew what waited on the other side. Because she was terrified she might finally discover the truth. For nearly a full minute, she stood there, staring at the number on the door, thinking about 20 years of memories, 20 years of trust, 20 years of believing she knew the people closest to her. Then she reached for the handle. And everything changed. Because what Sarah saw inside that room wasn't just betrayal. It was the beginning of a much larger story. A story that neither Daniel nor Lauren realized was about to turn against them. Sarah pushed the door open slowly. For years afterward, she would remember every detail of those first few seconds with painful clarity. The soft glow of a bedside lamp. The television playing quietly in the background. An ice bucket sitting on a table beside a half-finished bottle of wine. And Daniel, standing near the bed, frozen, his face drained of color. For a moment nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It felt as though time itself had stopped. Then Sarah's eyes shifted and landed on Lauren, her best friend, the woman who had celebrated birthdays in her home, the woman who had cried on her shoulder after breakups, the woman she had trusted with secrets she had never told anyone else. Lauren was sitting on the edge of the bed, and the look on her face told Sarah everything she needed to know. Not because of what Lauren was doing, because of what she wasn't doing. She wasn't confused. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't asking why Sarah was there. She looked caught, like someone whose biggest fear had finally become reality. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. Daniel finally stepped forward. Sarah. Just one word. Her name. And somehow it sounded smaller than it ever had before. Sarah stared at him, then at Lauren, then back at Daniel. Neither of them knew what to say. Neither of them knew how to explain years of deception in a single sentence. And strangely, Sarah didn't ask them to. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't throw anything, didn't demand answers. Because the moment she saw them together, something unexpected happened. The questions disappeared. The uncertainty vanished. The months of confusion evaporated. For the first time in a very long time, everything made sense. Every late night, every business trip, every strange interaction, every uneasy feeling she couldn't explain, all of it suddenly fit together. And there was something strangely calming about finally seeing the truth. Even when the truth hurt. Especially when the truth hurt. Daniel took another step forward. Sarah, please let me explain. Still no response. Lauren looked down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. And that hurt more than anything else. Not the affair. Not the lies. Not the hotel room. The cowardice. Because after all these years, neither of them could even look at her. Sarah nodded once. Slowly, as though confirming something to herself. Then she did something neither of them expected. She smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a cruel smile. A tired smile. The smile of someone who had finally stopped arguing with reality. Daniel looked genuinely confused. Lauren looked terrified. Neither reaction surprised Sarah. Because they were expecting a victim. A breakdown. A confrontation. Instead, they were getting silence. And silence can be far more frightening. Sarah, Daniel said again. She raised a hand gently. Not aggressively. Just enough to stop him. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Sarah turned around and walked toward the door. Daniel stared. Lauren stared. Both too shocked to react. Finally Daniel rushed after her. Wait. Sarah stopped in the hallway. Daniel followed. His breathing was uneven. His carefully controlled world had just exploded. What are you doing? He asked. The question almost made her laugh. What was she doing? For months, she had been asking herself that same question, trying to understand what was happening around her, trying to make sense of things that never quite added up. Now she finally understood. And understanding changes everything. She looked directly at him. For the first time all night. You don't need to explain, she said quietly. Daniel blinked. What? You don't need to explain. His face twisted with confusion. Sarah, please. She shook her head. No. The word was calm. Firm. Final. Then she walked away and left both of them standing there. The drive home felt surreal. Sarah expected tears, expected anger, expected heartbreak. Instead, she felt numb, not empty, just distant, as though her mind had moved somewhere safer while it processed what happened. When she reached home, she sat alone in the dark living room. Hours passed. Midnight. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. Still she sat there, thinking, remembering, replaying years of memories through an entirely different lens. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, her phone rang. It was Lauren. Sarah watched the screen light up. Ignored it. A minute later, another call. Ignored. Then another. Then messages. Dozens of them. I'm sorry. Please talk to me. It's not what you think. We need to explain. Please answer. Sarah read none of them. Because there was nothing left to explain. At least that's what she believed. Until the next morning. The next morning was when things became strange. Daniel hadn't come home. That wasn't surprising. What surprised her was the envelope waiting in the mailbox. No return address. No name. Just a plain white envelope. Sarah almost threw it away. Almost. But something stopped her. She opened it. Inside was a flash drive. And a handwritten note. Only 6 words. You still don't know everything. Sarah read the note twice. Then a third time. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. Because whoever had sent the messages the night before clearly knew something. And now they were sending more. She looked at the flash drive. Small. Ordinary. Harmless. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything she had held in weeks. For nearly an hour it sat untouched on the kitchen table. Until curiosity finally won. Sarah inserted the drive into her laptop. A single folder appeared. No title. No explanation. Inside were dozens of files. Emails. Bank statements. Photographs. Business records. At first they seemed unrelated. Random pieces of information collected from different places. Then she started reading. And very quickly realized something that made her blood run cold. The affair wasn't the biggest secret Daniel and Lauren had been hiding. Not even close. Because buried inside those files was evidence suggesting they had been working together for years. Not just romantically. Financially. Strategically. And as Sarah continued opening document after document, one realization became impossible to ignore. She wasn't looking at the collapse of a marriage. She was looking at the outline of a plan. A plan that appeared to involve her. And whatever Daniel and Lauren were trying to accomplish, it was much bigger than an affair. Much bigger. And somewhere in those files was the answer to why. Sarah spent the next 4 hours at her kitchen table. The coffee she poured grew cold beside her. The sunlight outside shifted gradually across the room. And still she kept reading. At first, the documents looked disconnected. A bank transfer here. A business filing there. Random emails. Meeting schedules. Expense reports. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that immediately explained why an anonymous stranger had gone to such lengths to send them. Then she began organizing everything by date. And that was when the pattern emerged. The first thing she noticed was Lauren's name. It appeared far more often than it should have. Not just in personal correspondence. In business records. Financial records. Corporate communications. Documents connected to Daniel's company. For someone who supposedly had no involvement in the business, Lauren seemed remarkably present. Sarah opened another file. Then another. Then another. The deeper she looked, the more obvious it became. Lauren wasn't simply Daniel's affair partner. She was connected to something much larger. Something deliberate. By early afternoon, Sarah had covered nearly the entire dining table with printed pages. A timeline was beginning to take shape. And the timeline told a story. 5 years earlier, shortly after Daniel launched his consulting firm, Lauren's professional life had changed dramatically. According to public records, Lauren had created a small consulting company. Nothing unusual about that. Except the company appeared to have almost no visible clients. Almost no public activity. Almost no employees. And yet somehow it generated substantial revenue. Far more revenue than Sarah would have expected. Millions of dollars over several years. The numbers didn't make sense. Not on their own. But then Sarah compared the payment dates against Daniel's company records. Her stomach tightened. Many of the transactions aligned almost perfectly. Contracts awarded to Daniel's firm. Investor funding rounds. Major business expansions. Within days or weeks, money would flow toward Lauren's company. Not always directly. Often through multiple entities. Multiple accounts. Multiple layers. But the connection was there. Repeatedly. Consistently. Deliberately. Sarah leaned back in her chair, trying to process what she was seeing. Because if the records were accurate, then Daniel and Lauren weren't merely hiding a relationship. They were operating together. The question was why. And more importantly, toward what goal? Her phone suddenly rang. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment she considered ignoring it. Instead she answered. Hello. A man's voice responded. Calm. Measured. Professional. My name is Robert Hayes. Sarah immediately sat upright. The name meant nothing to her. Yet something about his tone commanded attention. I believe you've received some documents. Her pulse quickened. Who are you? There was a brief pause. Then he answered. I'm the person who sent them. Silence filled the line. Sarah stared out the window, trying to decide whether she should hang up. Demand answers. Call the police. Instead she listened. Because instinct told her this man knew something important. I understand this is difficult, Robert said. But before you ask questions, you need to know one thing. Sarah waited. The affair is real. The directness of the statement stunned her. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just fact. Robert continued. But the affair is not the reason I contacted you. A chill moved through her chest. Because that was exactly the conclusion she had started reaching herself. If not the affair, Sarah asked carefully, then what? The answer came immediately. You are being positioned. Sarah frowned. What does that mean? Another pause. Longer this time. As though Robert was choosing his words carefully. It means someone very close to you needs something from you. Sarah felt her grip tighten around the phone. Who? You already know who. Daniel. The name flashed through her mind instantly. Robert continued. For months I've been investigating a network of transactions connected to several companies. During that investigation, your husband's business appeared repeatedly. Sarah listened silently. Then Lauren's company appeared. Again, and again, and again. The same names. The same transactions. The same patterns. Eventually, Robert said, I realized the financial activity wasn't random. Sarah swallowed. What did you find? The answer changed everything. I found evidence suggesting that several future transactions depend entirely on your approval. The room seemed to shrink around her. My approval? Yes. Sarah stood up and began pacing. Nothing about that made sense. She wasn't involved in Daniel's company. She didn't manage Lauren's finances. She wasn't connected to their businesses. At least not directly. So why would anything depend on her? Robert seemed to anticipate the question. Tell me something, Sarah. His voice softened slightly. Has your husband asked you to sign anything recently? Sarah stopped walking. Completely. Because suddenly she remembered. 3 weeks earlier. A stack of documents Daniel brought home. Routine paperwork, he called it. Business restructuring forms. Nothing important. Nothing urgent. At least that's what he claimed. She hadn't signed them. Not yet. The memory hit her like a physical blow. How do you know about that? She whispered. For the first time during the conversation, Robert sounded genuinely concerned. Because I believe those documents are the reason this entire situation exists. Sarah felt her heart pounding. The affair. The lies. The financial records. The hidden transactions. The mysterious messages. And now this. Everything seemed to be converging toward the same point. The same objective. The same outcome. Her signature. Suddenly the hotel room felt different. The betrayal felt different. Not smaller. Never smaller. But different. As though the affair itself had been only one layer of a much larger deception. Robert spoke again. This is important, Sarah. She listened carefully. Whatever happens next. His voice grew serious. Do not sign anything. The line went quiet. And for several seconds neither of them spoke. Because both understood something had changed. Completely. Sarah had spent the last 24 hours believing she was uncovering an affair. Now she was beginning to realize she might be uncovering a plan. A plan years in the making. And if Robert was right, Daniel's greatest fear wasn't losing his wife. It was losing access to something he desperately needed. Something only Sarah could provide. The question was what? And the answer was hidden somewhere inside the growing mountain of evidence now covering her dining room table. Evidence that was about to reveal a truth far more shocking than infidelity. A truth Daniel never expected her to discover. For the rest of the afternoon, Sarah couldn't focus on anything except one question. What exactly did Daniel need from her? The question followed her from room to room. It lingered while she made coffee she never drank. It echoed while she stared at the stack of unsigned documents sitting inside a desk drawer. And by evening, it had become impossible to ignore. Because the more she thought about it, the more she realized something unsettling. Daniel had become unusually persistent about those papers. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention. Married couples signed documents all the time. Insurance forms, tax paperwork, investment updates, routine financial matters. But now that she looked back honestly, Daniel's behavior felt different. Too interested, too eager, too prepared. Almost as if the signatures mattered far more than he was willing to admit. The memory surfaced clearly. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had arrived home carrying a leather briefcase. He seemed excited. More excited than usual. During dinner, he talked endlessly about future opportunities. Business growth. Expansion. New partnerships. The kind of future he claimed they had always dreamed about. Then, almost casually, he produced the paperwork. Nothing complicated, he'd said with a smile. Just some restructuring documents. Sarah remembered skimming the first page. The language was dense, corporate, technical, the sort of paperwork most people never fully read. She'd started asking questions. Daniel immediately assured her everything was routine. Not yet. Because if she was correct, then Daniel's affair wasn't simply a personal betrayal. It wasn't even primarily romantic. It may have been strategic, part of a larger plan, a way to keep Lauren close, a way to coordinate activities, a way to achieve an objective that required secrecy. And if that objective involved her signature, then Daniel's interest in preserving the marriage suddenly made much more sense. Her phone buzzed. This time it was Daniel. The first call since the hotel. Sarah stared at the screen, watched it ring, stop, then ring again, and again. Finally she answered. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Daniel exhaled heavily. Sarah. His voice sounded exhausted, anxious, careful. I've been trying to reach you. Sarah remained silent. I know you're angry. The understatement almost made her laugh. I know things look bad. Look bad. The phrase felt absurd. Years of deception reduced to 2 words. Look bad. Daniel continued. I need to talk to you. Sarah finally spoke. About Lauren? A long pause. About everything. The answer came too quickly, too prepared, as though he'd anticipated the question. Sarah looked down at the documents spread across the table. The evidence. The transactions. The names. The signatures. No, she said quietly. Daniel sounded surprised. No, not yet. Another pause. Longer this time. Then his tone changed slightly. More urgent. Sarah, there are important business matters that can't wait. There it was. Not marriage. Not betrayal. Business. The shift confirmed what she already suspected. Daniel wasn't calling because he missed her. He wasn't calling because he regretted what happened. He was calling because something was slipping out of his control. And for the first time since opening that hotel door, Sarah felt certain of one thing. Whatever Daniel wanted, she was finally getting close to the truth. Close enough to make him nervous. And nervous people make mistakes. Big mistakes. The kind that expose everything. Sarah ended the call, then returned her attention to the documents. Because somewhere among those pages was the answer. And when she found it, Daniel's entire carefully constructed world might come crashing down. The next morning, Sarah woke up after barely 3 hours of sleep. Her mind had spent the entire night assembling pieces. Every conversation, every document, every strange coincidence, every lie. The affair no longer felt like the center of the story. It felt like a symptom, a visible crack in a much larger structure. And somewhere beneath that structure was the truth Daniel had worked so hard to keep hidden. The sun was barely up when her phone rang again. This time it was Robert Hayes. Sarah answered immediately. You found something, didn't you? She asked. Robert was silent for a moment. Yes. The seriousness in his voice immediately caught her attention. How much do you know about your family's assets? Sarah frowned. My family's assets? Yes. The question seemed unrelated, at least at first. My father left investments, she said carefully. Some real estate. A trust. And who controls the trust? Sarah paused. I do. Another brief silence. Then Robert sighed. I was hoping you'd say someone else. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What does that mean? It means, Robert said, that everything I've uncovered points back to one thing. Sarah waited. You. The answer landed heavily. For several seconds, she didn't speak. Because suddenly dozens of unrelated memories were colliding in her mind. The paperwork. The pressure to sign. The hidden transactions. The business restructuring. The timing of the affair. Everything. Robert continued. Several years ago, your father placed substantial assets inside a protected trust structure. Sarah nodded. She already knew that. What she didn't understand was why it mattered. The trust includes ownership rights connected to future development projects. Her pulse quickened. Now she was listening very carefully. Those projects have appreciated significantly. How significantly? Robert exhaled. Enough to attract people like Victor Reynolds. The room suddenly felt smaller, because she understood exactly what he meant. People like Victor Reynolds didn't chase small opportunities. They chased fortunes. And if Victor Reynolds was involved, then the numbers were likely enormous. Robert continued. Daniel appears to have spent years positioning himself to gain influence over those assets. Sarah closed her eyes. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Not because she doubted him, because she believed him. Deep down, she had already started reaching the same conclusion. The affair, the financial activity, the pressure, The secrecy, the lies. Everything pointed toward the same destination. Control. Not of her, of what she owned, or more accurately, of what Daniel believed he could eventually access through her. The realization hurt more than discovering the affair. Far more. Because affairs destroy trust. This destroyed history. 20 years of memories suddenly felt contaminated. Every anniversary, every promise, every conversation about the future. How much of it had been genuine? How much had been strategic? And perhaps the most painful question of all, when had love stopped being enough? There's something else, Robert said. Sarah opened her eyes. What? The timing. What about it? The timing doesn't make sense. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? If Daniel already had access to Lauren, already had financial connections to Victor Reynolds, already had years to position himself, Robert paused. Why the sudden urgency? The question hit her immediately, because she had been wondering the same thing. Why now? Why push so aggressively? Why risk everything? Why pressure her to sign documents after years of patience? Robert answered before she could ask. Something changed. Sarah stared out the window. Something changed. The phrase echoed in her mind. Because if Robert was right, then somewhere there was a catalyst, an event, a deadline, a reason the entire operation had suddenly accelerated. And if she could identify that reason, she might finally understand everything. Can you meet me? Robert asked. Sarah hesitated only briefly. Where? He gave her the address. A small office building downtown. Nothing flashy. Nothing memorable. The kind of place people rarely notice. 2 hours later she parked outside. The building looked ordinary. Almost disappointingly ordinary. Yet as she stepped inside, Sarah felt nervous. Because every answer she found seemed to create 10 more questions. A receptionist directed her upstairs. Robert was waiting. For a man who had become central to her life in only 48 hours, he looked surprisingly normal. Mid-50s. Gray hair. Conservative suit. The face of someone people would overlook. Perhaps intentionally. After a brief introduction, he led her into a conference room. The walls were covered with documents. Photographs. Timelines. Financial charts. At first glance it resembled something from a crime investigation. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. Robert pointed toward one section. Start here. Sarah approached slowly. Photographs of Daniel. Photographs of Lauren. Photographs of Victor Reynolds. Business records connecting all three. Years of connections. Years of overlap. Years of cooperation. The scale stunned her. Because whatever this was, it wasn't recent. It had been developing for a very long time. Then Robert handed her a folder. This is what changed. Sarah opened it. The first page was a valuation report. She scanned the numbers, then froze. Read them again. Then a third time. The amount was staggering, far larger than she imagined. Her father's trust had recently become connected to a massive redevelopment project scheduled for approval within months. If approved, the value of the trust would increase dramatically. Life-changing money. Generational money. The kind of wealth that attracts attention. The kind of wealth that destroys people. Suddenly everything made sense. The urgency. The paperwork. The pressure. The timing. Victor Reynolds hadn't been interested in Daniel. Not really. Daniel was a bridge. A pathway. A means to reach something far more valuable. And Sarah was standing at the center of it. Robert watched her carefully. Now you understand. She nodded slowly. Because she did. At least partly. But one question remained. Perhaps the most important question. If they needed my signature, she said quietly. Robert nodded. Yes. Then why risk the affair? For the first time, Robert's expression darkened. Because apparently he had already considered that possibility. And he didn't like the answer. I don't think they intended for you to find out. Sarah stared at him. Robert continued. I think they got careless. The words hung in the air. Careless. Not remorseful. Not conflicted. Careless. As though 20 years of marriage and friendship had simply become obstacles they stopped respecting. Sarah looked back at the photographs. At Daniel. At Lauren. At the people she once trusted most. And something inside her shifted. The grief was still there. The betrayal was still there. But something new was emerging. Clarity. Because for days she had been reacting. Processing. Trying to understand. Now she finally knew enough to act. Robert seemed to recognize the change immediately. What are you thinking? Sarah looked directly at him. Then at the evidence. Then at the valuation report. Finally she smiled. Not out of happiness. Out of certainty. The same certainty she felt when she walked away from the hotel room. They think I'm still playing defense. Robert raised an eyebrow. And Sarah closed the folder. They have no idea the game is about to change. And for the first time since the affair was exposed, she wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about strategy. Because Daniel and Lauren believed they were controlling the story. What they didn't realize was that Sarah had finally learned the truth. And people become very dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. For the next 2 weeks, Sarah did something Daniel never expected. Nothing. At least, that's how it appeared from the outside. She didn't confront him publicly. She didn't hire a divorce attorney immediately. She didn't post cryptic messages online. She didn't tell mutual friends what she had discovered. And most importantly, she didn't let Daniel know how much she knew. That decision would change everything. Because while Daniel believed he was managing a crisis, Sarah was quietly gathering information. The less she reacted, the more comfortable he became. And comfortable people often reveal things they would otherwise hide. The first sign appeared 3 days later. Daniel showed up at the house. Not unexpectedly. Not dramatically. He simply knocked on the front door carrying flowers. The gesture might have worked once. Years earlier. Before the hotel room. Before the lies. Before the evidence. Sarah opened the door and studied him carefully. He looked tired. Genuinely tired. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Wrinkles she hadn't noticed before. For a brief moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then she remembered the documents. The affair. The planning. And the feeling disappeared. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Sarah stepped aside. Daniel entered. The house felt different now. Not because the furniture had changed. Because the trust had vanished. Every room seemed filled with invisible memories. And every memory now carried questions. Daniel sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Sarah had spent countless nights reviewing evidence. He looked around nervously, as though sensing something had shifted. Because it had. "What do you want, Daniel?" The question surprised him. Not angry. Not emotional. Just direct. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to answer. Then he leaned forward. "I made mistakes." Sarah said nothing. "I know I've hurt you." Still nothing. The silence forced him to continue. Lauren meant nothing. The statement was so absurd Sarah almost laughed. Years of deception. Years of coordination. And somehow Lauren meant nothing. The lie sounded pathetic. Even Daniel appeared uncomfortable saying it. "Sarah." His voice softened. "I want to fix this." There it was. The word. Fix. Not understand. Not explain. Fix. As though the marriage were a damaged machine. As though trust could be repaired with enough effort. Sarah studied him. Carefully. The man sitting across from her was familiar. And completely unfamiliar at the same time. A stranger wearing the face of her husband. "What exactly are you trying to fix?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. His expression changed. Only slightly. But Sarah noticed. Because she was paying attention now. Very close attention. The marriage. The answer came too quickly. Too automatically. Sarah nodded slowly. Then asked the question she already knew the answer to. "What about the paperwork?" Daniel froze. Only for a second. But it was enough. A tiny hesitation. Barely noticeable. Yet impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. What paperwork? The performance wasn't convincing. Not anymore. The restructuring documents. Relief flashed across his face. Subtle, but real. Apparently, he feared she meant something else. "Oh." He forced a laugh. "Those." Sarah waited. "They aren't important right now." Another lie. And not a particularly good one. Because if the documents weren't important, he wouldn't have spent weeks pushing her to sign them. Sarah leaned back. Watching. Listening. Learning. Every word revealed something. Every reaction confirmed another piece of the puzzle. And what she was learning made one thing increasingly clear. Daniel was scared. Not heartbroken. Not devastated. Scared. The distinction mattered. Because heartbreak creates grief. Fear creates mistakes. And Daniel was beginning to make plenty of them. After 40 minutes, he finally left. The flowers remained untouched on the counter. Sarah watched his car disappear down the street. Then her phone rang. "Robert." "How did it go?" Sarah smiled slightly. "He lied." Robert chuckled. "About what?" "Everything." The answer didn't surprise him. It didn't surprise her either. Because by now, deception had become Daniel's default language. The surprising part was how transparent it had become. Months earlier she might have believed him. Years earlier she definitely would have. Now she could practically predict his lies before he spoke them. "Good," Robert said. Sarah frowned. "Good. Very good." She waited for an explanation. The more pressure Daniel feels, the more likely he is to expose what comes next. Sarah looked out the window. What comes next? Robert's answer arrived immediately. Victor Reynolds. The name again. Always the same name. The shadow behind everything. The person neither Daniel nor Lauren ever discussed openly. And perhaps the person with the most to lose. What about him? Robert hesitated, then opened a door Sarah wasn't prepared for. I think Victor is getting impatient. The words landed heavily. Because impatience explained a lot. The sudden urgency, the aggressive timeline, the pressure surrounding the paperwork, the acceleration of events. But it also suggested something else. Something dangerous. People with money and influence rarely enjoy delays, especially when those delays threaten enormous profits. What happens if he doesn't get what he wants? Sarah asked. The silence that followed told her everything. Robert eventually answered, I don't know. And somehow that was the most concerning response possible. Because Robert was a man who usually seemed to know everything. If even he couldn't predict Victor Reynolds, then the situation was becoming more complicated, more unpredictable, and potentially more dangerous. That evening, Sarah received another surprise. An email, this time from Lauren. The subject line contained only 2 words. Please read. Sarah stared at the screen for several seconds before opening it. The message was surprisingly short. No excuses, no explanations, no dramatic declarations. Just a request. Lauren wanted to meet. Alone. No Daniel. No attorneys. No interruptions. According to the email, there were things Sarah deserved to know. Things Daniel would never tell her. Sarah reread the message 3 times. Part of her wanted to ignore it completely. Another part was curious. Because if Lauren was reaching out independently, something had changed. People rarely break ranks without a reason. And after everything Sarah had learned, she no longer believed in coincidences. Especially not involving Lauren. She forwarded the email to Robert. His response arrived 10 minutes later. 1 sentence. Meet her. Sarah stared at the message, then looked back at Lauren's email. For the first time in days, she felt the familiar sensation of uncertainty returning. Because whatever happened next, one thing seemed increasingly likely. The alliance between Daniel and Lauren was beginning to crack. And when people who share secrets turn against each other, the truth has a way of escaping, often all at once. Sarah had a feeling Lauren was about to tell her something important, something capable of changing the entire story again. The question wasn't whether Lauren would talk. The question was why she had finally decided to. Sarah agreed to meet Lauren 2 days later. Not because she trusted her. That possibility had disappeared forever. And not because she believed Lauren suddenly wanted to do the right thing. People rarely transform overnight, especially after years of deception. No, Sarah agreed for a much simpler reason. Information. At this point, information was more valuable than anger, more valuable than closure, more valuable than revenge. Because every new piece of information brought her closer to understanding the truth. And understanding the truth had become her priority. The meeting was scheduled for 11 in the morning at a small cafe on the north side of the city. The kind of place where nobody paid attention to strangers. The kind of place where difficult conversations could happen unnoticed. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early. Not out of nervousness. Out of habit. Years in consulting had taught her that preparation mattered. Especially when dealing with people whose motives remained unclear. She chose a table near the back, ordered coffee, and waited. At exactly 11 o'clock, Lauren walked through the door. For a moment, Sarah barely recognized her. Not because Lauren looked dramatically different. Because she looked diminished. Tired. Worn down. The confident woman who once commanded attention in every room seemed strangely absent. Lauren spotted Sarah immediately. Their eyes met. Neither smiled. Neither waved. Lauren approached slowly and sat down. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt uncomfortable. Not hostile. Just heavy. Like 2 people standing among the ruins of something neither fully understood anymore. Finally, Lauren exhaled. You look good. Sarah almost laughed. The comment felt absurd, as though they were old friends meeting after a misunderstanding. Instead, she remained silent. Lauren nodded slightly, apparently recognizing how ridiculous the statement sounded. Fair enough. Another silence followed. Then Lauren surprised her. I'm not here to apologize. Sarah raised an eyebrow. That wasn't what she expected. Most people began with apologies. Real or fake. Lauren continued. Not because I'm not sorry. She looked down at her hands. Because I don't think sorry means anything anymore. The honesty caught Sarah off guard. For the first time, Lauren sounded genuine. Not manipulative, not strategic, just honest. And somehow that made the conversation even more uncomfortable. Then why are you here? Sarah asked. Lauren looked up, directly into her eyes. Because you're in danger. Sarah stared at her. The answer was so unexpected she wasn't sure she heard it correctly. What? Lauren glanced around the cafe, as though checking whether anyone was listening, then lowered her voice. I know how that sounds. Yes, Sarah replied. It does sound strange. Lauren nodded. I deserve that. For several moments, she seemed to struggle with what to say next, as though she had rehearsed the conversation repeatedly but still couldn't find the right words. Finally, she spoke. Everything started with money. Sarah felt her attention sharpen immediately. Money. Not love. Not attraction. Not romance. Money. The answer aligned perfectly with everything Robert had uncovered. Lauren continued. Years ago, Daniel met Victor Reynolds. Sarah remained silent, listening carefully. At first, it was just business. Lauren laughed softly. A bitter laugh. At least that's what Daniel told himself. The bitterness in her voice suggested she no longer believed that version of events. Victor had a reputation. She looked away briefly. The kind of reputation that makes people nervous. Sarah remembered the articles she had read. The lawsuits. The accusations. The whispers. Nothing proven, yet enough to create concern. Lauren continued. But Daniel wasn't nervous. Another bitter laugh. He was impressed. Sarah could picture it. Daniel had always admired ambitious people. Successful people. Powerful people. Sometimes too much. Especially when he believed they possessed something he wanted. Victor promised opportunities. Lauren's voice softened. Growth. Expansion. Wealth. She paused. Everything Daniel thought he deserved. The words hung in the air. Everything Daniel thought he deserved. Sarah felt a strange sadness hearing them. Because deep down, she knew there was truth there. Not the whole truth, but enough. Over the years, Daniel's ambition had changed. What once felt inspiring had gradually become something else. Something harder. Something hungrier. Something that never seemed satisfied. Lauren continued. At first it was small. Meetings. Introductions. Connections. Then larger opportunities appeared. More money. More influence. More promises. And eventually, she stopped. Sarah waited. Eventually what? Lauren looked directly at her. Eventually Victor learned about your trust. The words landed like a physical blow. Sarah's expression remained calm. Inside, however, everything tightened. Because hearing someone else say it made the situation feel more real. More personal. More deliberate. Lauren continued. Once he understood what the trust might become. She shook her head. He stopped seeing Daniel as a partner. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? Lauren answered immediately. He started seeing Daniel as a tool. The statement stunned her, because it reversed everything. In Sarah's mind, Daniel had always seemed like one of the architects of the plan. Now Lauren was suggesting something different. Something darker. That Daniel himself might have been manipulated. Used. Controlled. Not innocent. Never innocent. But perhaps not as powerful as he imagined. Lauren continued. Victor knew he couldn't approach you directly. Sarah understood why. A direct approach would have created questions. Attention. Scrutiny. Far too risky. So he approached the person closest to you. Daniel. The answer didn't need to be spoken. Lauren saw the realization in Sarah's eyes. Daniel believed he was building a future. Her voice grew quieter. Victor was building leverage. The distinction changed everything. Because leverage requires pressure. Leverage requires vulnerability. Leverage requires people willing to make compromises. And Daniel had spent years making them, one at a time, until he barely recognized what he had become. Sarah looked at Lauren carefully. Where do you fit into this? The question seemed to hurt. Genuinely hurt. Lauren looked away. For the first time since arriving, tears appeared in her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not performative tears. The kind people fight desperately to hide. I made a choice. Her voice cracked slightly. A terrible choice. Sarah said nothing. Lauren swallowed hard. When Daniel first approached me, he made it sound harmless. A pause. Then profitable. Another pause. Then inevitable. Sarah listened quietly. Because she understood something important. People rarely wake up and decide to destroy their lives. Most disasters happen gradually. One compromise. Then another. Then another. Until the person staring back from the mirror feels unfamiliar. Lauren continued. I kept telling myself I could stop. The tears finally escaped. I kept telling myself it wasn't hurting anyone. Her laugh sounded broken. God, I was stupid. Sarah watched her carefully, trying to determine whether any of this was real, whether Lauren truly regretted what happened, or whether this was simply another performance. Then Lauren said something impossible to fake, something so raw it silenced every remaining doubt. I lost myself a long time before I lost you. The cafe fell quiet around them. Neither woman spoke, because some truths don't require responses. They simply exist. Heavy, uncomfortable, undeniable. Finally, Sarah asked the question that mattered most. Why now? Lauren immediately understood. Why tell the truth now? Why risk everything now? Why betray Daniel now? The answer arrived instantly, and the fear in Lauren's eyes made Sarah's blood run cold. Because whatever Lauren was about to reveal, it terrified her. And terrified people rarely lie. They moved up the timeline. Sarah frowned. What timeline? Lauren leaned forward, lowering her voice almost to a whisper. The paperwork isn't the end. Sarah's stomach tightened. What is? Lauren's answer came softly, but the impact felt enormous. You are. And suddenly Sarah understood this conversation was about to become far more dangerous than she imagined. For several seconds, Sarah simply stared at Lauren. The noise of the cafe seemed to disappear. Conversations faded into the background. Coffee machines hissed somewhere in the distance. But Sarah barely heard any of it, because Lauren's final words kept repeating in her mind. The paperwork isn't the end. You are. It wasn't just what Lauren said. It was how she said it. The fear, the certainty, the regret. All of it felt real, painfully real. Sarah leaned forward. What exactly does that mean? Lauren looked down at her coffee. For a long moment, she couldn't seem to find the words. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded exhausted. Victor doesn't care about the trust. Sarah frowned. That doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me either at first. Lauren shook her head. The trust is valuable. The projects are valuable. The money is valuable. But that's not what Victor wanted most. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Then what did he want? Lauren met her eyes. Control. The answer landed heavily, because suddenly everything fit together. Victor wasn't chasing a transaction. He wasn't chasing a signature. He wasn't chasing a single deal. He was chasing influence. Long-term influence. The kind that lasts decades. The kind that grows. The kind that multiplies. And if he gained control over the trust, the projects, and the future assets connected to them, he wouldn't just make money. He would gain power. The realization made Sarah feel sick. Not because of the money. Because of the years. Years of planning. Years of manipulation. Years of deception. All aimed toward a single objective. And somewhere along the way, the people she trusted most had become part of it. Lauren wiped her eyes. Daniel thought he was becoming a partner. A bitter smile crossed her face. Victor never saw him that way. Sarah remembered something Robert had said. Daniel wasn't the destination. He was the bridge. A tool. A pathway. A means to an end. And suddenly she understood the tragedy of it. Daniel had spent years sacrificing his integrity in pursuit of power, only to discover he was never the one holding it. The silence between them stretched. Finally, Sarah stood. The conversation was over. Not because she had all the answers, but because she had enough. Enough to understand what happened. Enough to understand why. Enough to decide what came next. Lauren looked up. Sarah. Sarah paused. For the first time since sitting down, Lauren looked completely broken. I really did love you. The words hung in the air. Complicated. Painful. Impossible to fully understand. Sarah believed she meant them. And somehow that made everything worse. Because betrayal is easier to process when it comes from enemies. It's harder when it comes from people who genuinely cared about you and chose themselves anyway. Sarah nodded once, then walked away. She never saw Lauren again. 3 months later, everything collapsed. The investigations Robert had quietly been assisting eventually reached federal authorities. Financial irregularities triggered audits. Audits triggered subpoenas. Subpoenas triggered discoveries. And discoveries triggered consequences. One after another. Like dominoes. Victor Reynolds found himself facing scrutiny from multiple agencies. Several of his business entities were frozen pending investigation. Partnerships dissolved. Investors withdrew. Associates disappeared. The empire he spent years building suddenly looked far less untouchable. Daniel's company survived. Technically, but barely. Contracts vanished. Clients left. Expansion plans died almost overnight. The future he had spent years chasing evaporated before his eyes. Not because Sarah destroyed him, because the truth finally caught up with him. And the truth tends to collect interest. The divorce finalized quietly. No public spectacle. No dramatic courtroom battles. No attempts at revenge. By then, Sarah no longer wanted revenge. She wanted peace. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. One afternoon, nearly a year later, she stood inside one of the redevelopment sites connected to her family's trust. Construction crews moved through the structure. Engineers reviewed plans. Workers prepared for the next phase. Life was moving forward. As it always does. Robert stood beside her, looking over the city skyline. "You ever regret not signing?" he asked. Sarah laughed softly. The question felt almost surreal now. "No." Robert smiled. "I didn't think so." For a few moments neither spoke. Then Sarah looked out across the city, at the people walking below, the traffic, the buildings, the endless movement of life. And she thought about everything that had happened. The hotel room, the affair, the lies, the documents, the manipulation, the years she spent believing she knew the people closest to her. Then she thought about something else, something more important, the moment she chose herself. Because looking back, she realized the hotel room wasn't the moment her life fell apart. It was the moment her life started becoming honest. Painful, but honest. And honesty is worth more than comfort built on lies. A few weeks later, Sarah launched a foundation dedicated to helping people rebuild after financial and emotional betrayal. Not because she considered herself a hero. Far from it. Because she understood something now that she hadn't understood before. Many people stay in bad situations because they believe leaving will destroy them. They believe they won't recover. They believe the unknown is more frightening than the familiar, even when the familiar is hurting them. Sarah wanted to change that. One person at a time. One story at a time. One second chance at a time. Years later, during an interview, a reporter asked her a question. A simple question. If you could say one thing to Daniel today, what would it be? Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. With peace. "I would thank him." The reporter looked surprised. "So much of your success came after what happened." Sarah nodded. "Exactly." The reporter waited. Sarah looked out the window before answering. "If he hadn't shown me who he really was, I might have spent the rest of my life believing a lie." The interview clip spread online. Millions watched it. Many focused on the scandal, the betrayal, the money, the headlines. But those who understood the story saw something else. A lesson. Because this was never really a story about an affair. It was a story about value. About knowing your worth before someone else decides it for you. About recognizing when loyalty is one-sided. About understanding that trust should be earned, not exploited. And perhaps most importantly, about having the courage to walk away when someone mistakes your kindness for weakness. As the sun set over the city that evening, Sarah stood alone on the terrace of the Foundation's headquarters. The wind moved gently through her hair. The skyline glowed gold. And for the first time in many years, she felt completely free. Not because she won. Not because Daniel lost. Not because Victor's plans failed. But because she finally understood something her younger self had never known. The people who truly love you don't need access to your money. They don't need control over your future. They don't need leverage. They don't need ownership. They simply choose you. And anyone who only values you after discovering what you can provide was never valuing you at all. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting revenge. Sometimes it's refusing to become the person betrayal wants you to be. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away, close the door behind you, and never look back. If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever discovered that someone valued what you could do for them more than who you were? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful true story-inspired documentary. Because the next story might change the way you see trust forever.